Okay. I must say, you know what? When I do these little meetings, I was just saying to Teresa, it really is a refuge from the stuff going on in the world, which it doesn't
Really?
lend itself to a rational analysis, which is what we're up to here. Just trying to be as reasonable and sensible and logical as we possibly can. That's our whole uh, modus operandi, and that doesn't seem to be au courant in the world outside this little group. Uh, so anyway, we're going to return to Kant today, and uh, uh, as I think I said before, it's a piece of work trying to look. Look, here's I mentioned Norman Kemp Smith is the best. There are others, but probably the best source. And look at the size of this. This is just a commentary on the critique of pure reason. And I have to condense it all into a couple of hours. So it's not easy for my poor little brain to do this. But before we get started, I want to mention a couple of things. I thought I saw Meredith come up here and then she disappeared. Um, I want to review a couple of things that just odds and ends, kind of, I guess, housekeeping. Um, One of the things I wanted to mention is I sometimes I go back and look at these, and I looked at the one in the Mino a little bit, and I'm not sure everybody was convinced, or it's not you have to be convinced. I'm not sure everybody really understood why that's a puzzle. And I'm happy to review it if there's anybody that still has a question mark in their mind about what the point of that dialogue was. The reason I bring it up is because it's gonna tumble down through the ages and be important to the whole discussion. Nobody?
Are
Everybody
you, are,
okay?
are you talking about the puzzle with how do I double the size of this box?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the way you showed it on the screen and the way Socrates described it are different.
How are they different?
In other words, you showed it where it's an extension coming up, where he just says, "Hey, let's draw a diagonal and just make a bigger box and draw a diagonal through it." In other words, the way he drew it made it a little easier to get. If you
Uh,
go back and read the I thought, I'm going to go back and look at that again. But it's still, you still have to, how do I do this? Right? Because he says, well, I can't draw twice as big because I can't add another square on top of that because now I got four times rather than one time, two times. Um, but by drawing the diagonal that way was a little easier to grasp, to kind of get to. Does that making sense?
well, yeah, as a matter of fact, if you go look at the literature on this, it's not drawn the same way in all the literature. Uh, I I've always used that way of drawing it, which is also common, but I'm just reading an article in Scientific American today about the aha moment when you get something. I'm just starting it, but it's some people have done some brain research on exactly what part of the brain goes aha. But this goes back to Archimedes saying eureka. And I think I've told you guys many times that a lot of this stuff I looked at for 10 years without seeing anything there. And then on one day I went, oh, this is really an issue. And the Mino was one of those things. I didn't think anything of it. It took me years to figure out. And I finally read an article that made sense to me. But uh, the, basically, however you draw it out, the point is uh, that we want to know is that the boy seems to have an understanding of how geometry works that he could not have learned because we know he was a slave that had no such training. And so the question that echoes down through the ages is you could call it innate knowledge or a priori knowledge. Human beings seem to have some kinds of knowledge that they just possess for no reason, not having had it introduced to them. And so the question is, how do we explain that? And what is it knowledge of? Is it knowledge that is just an hallucination in our mind and has no relationship to the actual universe? Or is it somehow echoing, like Einstein said? Is it a is it in harmony with the universe, which is, I think, the word Einstein used and Plato used? Uh, so that's the question. It, I guess whether or not you actually know what that puzzle does is a little bit less important than you understand that there is a real issue, that this isn't something some hoity-toity or weird philosophers have just made up that's of no significance. It's a real question, a real mysterious question about why the human mind has this knowledge that we didn't learn. Deborah,
Am I muted?
no?
No.
Okay. Um, I think when you
It'd be
first
funny if
presented,
you said, it'd be funny if you said, "Am I muted?" and then you muted yourself. But
yeah, or
anyway,
everybody said, yeah, yeah, I know.
please
Okay.
do.
When you were explaining this problem and I was drawing it as you were talking, what you said was double the square or something like that. So I just drew a rectangle, a second square next to the existing square.
Mhm.
And then as the discussion continued, I realized what the question was, is how to create another square. And that I think was not, that's what threw me off anyway, was that I didn't know the end result had to also be a square. That wasn't clarified. So once that was clarified, yeah, I was the slave girl. I got it. But maybe that was something that threw some people off besides me. I don't know.
Well, you're not the only one. A person who's an old friend of mine was a professor of English composition at San Francisco State for years, and she couldn't get it through her head, and it was because she was drawing it herself, but she was drawing it not correctly, and probably the fault of my description. She wasn't drawing it correctly, so it was confusing to her. And again, I'm not so concerned that you know that exact puzzle. The thing that is important, though, is that you know that what Plato has demonstrated, and I think this is pretty accepted, that he has demonstrated, and I do it that's why I've done the experiment in my class every year for all those years, was to have an actual scientific demonstration of that exact principle that my kids do come up with it. Yeah, Barry.
When we first talked about that, and I think I recall Alan was talking about some of the things that we see in newborn humans, infants that indicate a pre-existing sort of hardwired operating system to the brain that is not dependent on sensory learning. I think that to me, it sort of was, well, that kind of discoveries about early childhood development just support the idea of the Meno to me, that we are not born with a tabula rasa, that there are some pre-existing operating system to the brain.
Right. Uh, it well, it's an ongoing mystery. This has not been resolved. Hey, Douglas, could you mute yourself? And I noticed one other thing. Ann, I see. Are you home now?
Now he's muted.
Well, she's muted. Yeah.
I'm
She.
home. I'm home. This is our bedroom.
So, are you happy to be home?
I am happy to be home, but it's a lot harder because I can't use a wheelchair. I have to use a walker.
Uh-oh.
I was right. And, so Peter has to do practically everything for me, but I'm happy to be here. And it's good. It's the logical next step.
Well, you're lucky to have Peter.
I am very lucky to have Peter. Yeah. Yesterday we both kind of slept for about 24 hours. I mean, we just crashed. Yeah.
On behalf of your home, welcome home.
Thank you.
Glad to see it. At least it's progress.
Yeah, I know. Thanks. Bit by bit.
Um, okay, back to Kant. Now, the reason I wanted to clarify this now, and I'm willing to go further along these lines if anybody else still wants to. Well, we're not going to resolve it here because it hasn't been resolved by philosophy yet. But if there's something about the puzzle that you'd like to bring up, now's a good time because Kant, the first real answer to this after 2,000 years was Immanuel Kant. Uh, Otherwise, Aristotle just said it didn't exist. Aristotle was essentially a tabula rasa guy, but Aristotle, I think it can be demonstrated he's wrong. I mean, I think I've demonstrated in my classes he's wrong, and the stuff you just said about early childhood recognition of things also demonstrates that there is some kind of knowledge that's inborn. Uh, so that that position, which was also taken by the empiricists Locke, Berkeley, and
I
Hume.
just don't buy. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that.
What don't you buy? Good.
I buy
That's
that the
good.
brain. I buy that the brain, the infant brain, has structures that allow it to learn stuff, but that's different than having the knowledge at birth.
You want to comment, Alan?
No, but I mean, the thought that I'm having is that we are all familiar with evolution and sort of take it for granted, which means that human beings are part of a continuum that evolved out of other kinds of beings. And when you look at other animals, all of them have prior knowledge and are born with it. And the more primitive they are in our perspective, the more initial knowledge that they have. I've been following a family of geese that live just a few blocks from me on a pond, and the babies immediately know how to swim. I mean, within a couple of days, they know how to swim, and they follow their parents in a straight line with the mother leading the line and the father coming up at the end. I mean, this kind of knowledge is not learned. They all geese just do it, and when you watch a spider make a web, no parent ever taught the
No
spider how to
parent
make a
spider.
web, and yet it's all identical. I
But
mean,
it, what is
almost.
knowledge? What is knowledge, though? I mean, these sort of at some point it's just ingrained brain structure, or is it actually what is knowledge? I mean, define, please. I mean, I just
Well, to use a 20th century way of addressing that problem, asking a question like what is knowledge is not what language was designed to do. Uh, if I ask you, Doug, do you have any knowledge of, well, I'm not actually sure what you do, but I could ask, where did Meredith go? I thought she showed up. Anyway, Neil, if I ask Neil, do you have any knowledge of the law? He would say, "Yeah, I have some knowledge of the law. I don't know everything, but I know." But just to say what is knowledge is a question that's so broad and vague that it it can't be meaningfully answered. So this is the kind of thing that Socrates was always doing. What is courage? And the 20th century criticism of that, which by the way still doesn't put it to rest, I'm afraid. Uh, if you ask what is courage, again, you're asking for this broad definition of courage. But on the other hand, we know what it means. If I say, wow, that was courageous, that guy that rescued those people in Texas, that was really courageous. We're not puzzled about what the word means. But then if you just say, well, what is courage? it's not clear what the right answer would be. Whereas in the other one, yeah, are you going to deny that that guy was courageous? I don't think you would. So it's clear we understand what it means, but how come we can't define it then? That was Socrates' uh, main question throughout his the career that we know about is asking these questions that don't seem to be readily answerable and are vague, and so they sort it out. But so, in answer to you, what you said, Doug, uh, I'm not sure we can make a clear answer to that. And let's actually, with that in mind, let's go on to Kant because okay, Doug, you've got your hand up? No, okay.
I'm just saying, Tony, one could define knowledge as something that is learned.
Well, that the whole point is that we seem to have knowledge here that wasn't learned, and that's what the
Um,
um,
is that knowledge though, or is that just something inherent in some weird brain structure
well,
thing? Which
that's the
I
question. Is
mean,
it if it's knowledge, it would have to be knowledge of something. And what if it's just a hallucination? It's something we think we know, but it actually doesn't have any referent in the real world.
all right. I apologize for even bringing it. It
No,
sounds
no, no. These are all good questions, Doug. Absolutely. They're not irrelevant at all. And please don't feel like you have to apologize. That is not what we need. So Kant, okay, so Kant is the first guy that's going to address this issue with a significant um, uh, framework of it, and he is stimulated by Hume because what Hume says is that well, I'll tell you how Kant summarizes what Hume says. If I get here's this is a famous line by Kant. And he says, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. That's the actual quote. And that may not mean anything to you, but what he's saying there, and this was discovered by Hume, is that mathematics is just a system of squiggles and little marks on a paper that have a certain logical relationship uh, to each other, but without any input. Like if you have to have data to put into the mathematical equation before it's going to tell you anything about the real world. And so that's what Kant's saying. Just the uh, and Laurel's going to weigh in here in a minute, but just the mathematical formulas themselves don't tell us anything until you plug in data to the variables. The variables have to have data plugged into them, and then we have knowledge of the real world. Now, Jeff is shaking his head. That's wrong.
The formula is a generalization of all that other stuff. So in that sense, it is meaningful.
Well, are you saying that formula is a generalization of empirical observations?
I think it's deeper than that.
Well, deeper is a funny word. What do you mean it's deeper than that?
I could beg to be bailed out by Laurel here, who's spent more time in recent decades thinking about this than I have.
Now, Jeff, don't be a coward. Say it yourself.
Uh,
Well,
no, I think it is contributing to our comprehension and so-called knowledge if we can take things that we have found to be true and then generalize them in ways that let us uh, apply, let us come up with a rubric that is more generally useful than 2 + 2 is 4.
well, the
Wait,
mathematicians, I think, will tell you, and Laurel, please correct me, that when they come upon a proof of something, it feels like they've discovered it and not created it. So if they've discovered it,
No, I would shade that a little bit. There is a truth, and then there is the proof, and I think that the the finding a way to prove it is creative and exciting because of the creative act involved. But that's independent of the truth itself.
but the truth itself, isn't it something that most mathematicians and I shouldn't be speaking for them because I'm not one, describe it as discovering a truth, a relationship in mathematics. They discover it, they don't create it. One of the, okay, this is like
I think you're confusing the formula with the proof of the formula. They're different.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm going to weigh in with two brief examples. Okay. So brief example one, when we talk about proof versus a fact, at one time I was playing around with some random walk sort of math stuff on random walks, played and played and played and did some transformations. And at the end of the day, it came out with this equation, which looked familiar, but through a completely unrelated process that was very elegant and kind of, I would say cute, but I was told not to say cute about it. And I showed it to, and the person looked at me and said, "My God, it's the functional equation of the Riemann zeta function." And what I had actually found was a new way of proving something that was a well-known thing in math, the Riemann zeta function. But the way I got to it was a completely different pathway. And the proof was what was elegant because it was an unexpected consequence. But the end result was something that was known. It was just a whole new way of getting there. So the pathway was what was cool. Example two, and I think this goes back to when we were talking about whether the relationship to the real world comes from observation or whether it goes the other way. So, you learn in geometry that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But when you get a little farther on in geometry, you learn that that isn't true if you're operating on a surface that isn't flat. So geometry, analytic geometry has showed that the shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere is a great circle. It's part of the great circle. It took a long time, curiously, for people to apply that to figuring out how to save fuel in airplanes. It wasn't that they discovered that the shortest distance for a plane to fly was the Great Circle route. It was that mathematicians knew this fact and it got applied. But the mathematics existed before people started thinking about applying it. And the theorem, the theorem was out there. So
and isn't the mathematics independent of any observation of fuel savings?
it's independent, but can be applied. So you
It
learn.
can be applied, but the point is that without putting any values in the equations for the variables, it can't be applied. To be applied to anything, you have to have values to put in, do you not?
No, no. You can solve problems that are quite abstract, like
No,
what's
no, but I mean for it to apply to the real world, you have to have values. Like
um,
a plane uses so much fuel per mile, and I want to get around the world. I can't go in a straight line because that would take me through the center of the earth. But if I go in a curvature, but I have to know how much fuel it takes to go an hour in a straight line.
I would say that to apply it to the real world, you need the algorithm that says, tell me the 2 points on Earth, and I'll calculate the great circle. And then from that, you can calculate the distances, etc. But the algorithm, there's the theory that says what the shortest distance is. There's an algorithm that says how to apply that in the real world.
Okay, but where did the theory come from?
Tony,
Where'd the
Tony,
axiom come from?
Tony, back up a moment here. What you're saying is that the Mino problem was had no application to the real world because nobody
No, I'm not
defined what
saying.
size the square was to
No,
start.
no,
That
no,
that
not at
makes no
all.
sense.
That's not what I'm saying.
Are you saying that the sphere exists, that the properties of a sphere, which is what mathematicians are talking about, um, don't exist in um, a concrete sense until you have a sphere like the Earth that you're trying to talk about, that you can.
I'm saying that the sphere, the non-Euclidean geometry you're talking about exists in a kind of ethereal, mental, abstract realm that doesn't apply to the real world until values are put into the variables.
Doesn't don't most formulas have they there's a relationship x equals y plus z or something, but that's a relationship that always fits and is useful in and of itself, that relationship, to understand that relationship. Take any, you know, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I mean, it gives you a relationship that could be useful in many ways, right?
Well, yeah, there's no denying that. It's the question is where did the relationship come from? Where did the
Where,
relationship between A and B and C in a right triangle come from? Was it something we observed and figured out from our observations, or was it a rule that was considered abstractly and proven abstractly without any relationship to the real world?
I don't
Oh,
understand why this distinction is meaningful.
that's because you're not a philosopher.
yeah,
I was talking to a guy, I think I mentioned this, from Lawrence Livermore, a physicist, and I was bringing up this problem to him, and he says, "We don't care about that shit. We just know these formulas work. Don't bother me with this nonsense." And if you're not bothered by these questions, that's, all well and good. You can live all your life without ever having considered these for a minute, but they are not irrelevant to the history of philosophy. And you guys were suckers enough to sign up for this experience, and that's what you're getting. So it's a key. I guess you're just going to have to take my word for the fact that this is a key problem in Western intellectual thought since the time of Plato, and it is to this day not resolved. Where do we come up with these mathematical? I'm just going to give you one example of an argument against the empirical basis for mathematics, and there's many, but this I think was Frege came up with this around the turn of the century, last century, or the previous century, I guess. Anyway, if you have the distance between 1 and 0, or let's say 1 and 2, the distance between 1 and 0 in mathematics is an integer, a 1. That's the answer. Now, what if the problem is what is the difference between 1 with 10,000 zeros and then a 1 in the last digit place? That and the same number with 10,000 zeros and then a 2 in the play in that last place. Is the distance between the one and the two in that large number the exact same difference as the distance between regular old 1 and 2 without being a big number? What's the answer to that? Is it the same distance or is it a different distance?
It's infinite.
You'd have to say it's the same distance, right? I mean, that's
I'd,
mathematics. The numbers in math aren't going to get closer together or farther apart when the number gets very big, right? They stay the same distance apart. And if that's the case, did you discover that from the real world, from empiricism, or is there some experiment you could do to prove that in the real world empirically? Doug, you got your hand up.
yeah, I'd say that the words distance and further and closer have no meaning in that example.
Well, I hear that. That makes sense, but that doesn't that mean that mathematical numbers don't act like measurements in the real world? Because certainly the difference between this hand being 6 inches wide and being 6 inches wide uh, or twice 6 inches wide, certainly that has a meaning in the real world. But what I just said, are you saying it doesn't have a meaning in the real world?
I'm saying that I think that the to say are they the same distance apart I'm not sure I know what that means.
Well, exactly. Well, let's put it this way. Does that one with 10,000 zeros and then a one, if I subtract that from one from 10,000 with 10,000 zeros and a two, if I subtract that, do I get an integer that's the same size as the integer I would get between just one and two?
Yes. Yes.
Is is
I don't
the
play a
answer
mathematician on TV, so
is the answer to that problem the same in both cases?
Yes.
Yes.
Does
Okay,
infinity come into this? Come into play
no,
here?
no. And so how do you know that? How do you know the numbers act like that no matter how big they get? Because speed doesn't act like that. Time and space don't act like that. If you increase the speed a great amount till it's almost the speed of light, then time changes. How do we know that mathematics isn't like time? How do we know mathematics isn't like space? That when you get real big, it gets the numbers get closer together or farther apart. How do we know that?
So Tony, what mathematicians do to get around those questions is
Just say get rid of the philosophers.
no, they say that part of what we use philosophers for is to say that we are allowed to define a set of axioms, if you will,
Yes.
basic properties of numbers, and from those we can derive all these things, like that if you add
Well,
10,
that seems to imply that you've made up those axioms. Have you made them up?
we are allowed to state axioms, and
You're allowed to state
Yeah.
them. Well,
if you want to do mathematics, one of the and that's one of the things about the math philosophy people, if you will, philosophers of mathematics, is that they sort of resign themselves to the fact that math depends on the axioms you choose to set up at the beginning of what you're doing in math. And um, if, for example, you say that numbers have certain that integers have certain properties, then you can derive from that the properties of the rational numbers, the fractions and all of that.
right. Well, you said the math philosophers, but Plato wouldn't be one of those that would be counted among those because Plato doesn't say, "Okay, that's good enough for me." You just stipulate that that's what it is. And again, what I told you not to do is go look at Wikipedia and the philosophy of mathematics, and you'll see that today, as we speak, there are different schools of thought about what the status of mathematics is, what the what metaphysical status is. It just a okay? Let me stop this and just get back to Kant, and I'll tell you what Kant says about it, and because I feel like we're just gonna last forever on this conversation. Here's what
But
Kant.
I want to say one more thing, Tony, which
Okay.
one of the big advances in mathematics over the years has been saying what would happen if you change those axioms, if you use different axioms or a different basis of thinking. And
Right.
bases of thinking don't really exist as we think about them in the real world. And then I guess we come back to, well, where do they exist if they don't exist in the real world? And so I'm going to leave it there. But those questions that mathematicians enjoy, where do those ideas exist if they don't out of the real world? Then that's what I'm hoping Kant will shed light on.
Well, yes, I think so. I'm not sure shed light is the right word, but he'll address the problem. And remember, Einstein's big question was whether God could have created a universe that didn't answer to our understanding of mathematics. And Kant is going to say that that is a question that you can't meaningfully ask. And the reason you can't meaningfully ask it, I'm going to start reviewing some of the concepts that I brought up last time. Kant um, divides the world into the noumenal and the phenomenal, and everything we know is limited to the phenomenal world. And so yeah, it's best to think of the phenomenal as a limit. So that for Plato, the phenomenal world would be the world of the senses, the world we can perceive. Now, according to Kant, instead of remembering these things, like we were talking about early childhood, knowing certain things that they couldn't have learned, or the geese. Um, in terms of that, Kant wants to say the memories or whatever that inborn stuff is that we know are still perceptions of the phenomenal world because they're ideas that are in our mind, or the instinct to follow our mom, the goose, our mom, or for the monarch butterflies to follow the path that they're taking from Mexico to Nova Scotia and back. Those are actually things that we perceive in our mind. But what Kant says is that the mind that we want to know what the structure of the mind is that creates those perceptions. And the way we do that is by what he calls the transcendental deduction. We look at what consciousness, what world consciousness displays to us, and we ask ourselves, what must be the case in order for that to be portrayed? So I think last time somebody said, well, we all know that we feel differently about this or that music. And yes, we all have different minds, but we all have minds that see space and time. The four things he mentions are space, time, causality, and the uh, unity of apperception, the transcendental unity of apperception. What Kant says is these are not things that we know, they are frameworks through which our perceptions must pass in order for us to have any conception of the real world at all. So they're pre established structures in the mind that through which all of our perceptions must be filtered for us to see the world at all, to see it in any way at all. And I was comparing it last time to an operating system. If you had a mind that was like a digital camera, it would just see a million pixels coming and changing every second. It would be a vast amount of data uh, just flowing into your eyes at every second. But what you do is you process that information uh, with, well, we're not going to discuss, but the categories of the understanding that Kant uses, he says, well, here's how we divide it up. We divide it up into this thing and this thing, and that way our mind makes sense of having perceptions at all. And getting back to mathematics, mathematics is part of the structure through which we perceive the phenomenal world, according to Kant. So mathematics isn't something we perceive. It's one of those structures like space and time uh, through which our mind sorts the universe. Now, we can't say anything about the thing that's out there that's flowing. Kant calls it the Ding on sich, the thing in itself. The noumenal world is whatever is out there that's causing our perceptions, that's causing our experiences. We can't ever know that because everything we know is filtered through the structures that are inherent in our consciousness and necessary as preconditions to have any consciousness at all. And that's a different thing from what Plato says. Plato says that mathematics is something like a content of our mind that we inherit or remember from a former life. And Kant wants to say, no, it's not a content. It's not something we know as an object. It's something that shapes our perceptions of the real world, just like space and time do. Uh, so that is called the phenomenal world. Everything we experience is part of the phenomenal world, even our own internal thoughts, like our wishes and fears and emotions and aspirations. All of those are part of the phenomenal world that we experience. We experience our fears. We experience our druthers and our tastes. We experience those things. They're not consciousness, consciousness itself. That's what's producing our experiences, and we can never experience the thing that is doing the experiencing, and that's why Kant says we have to do this transcendental deduction, which I compared, if you remember last time, to W.T. Jones' uh, uh, analogy of the guy sorting or going into a warehouse and you see that the oranges have been sorted in various arrangements, and from that you deduce what the sorting process was. That's what Kant. Well, Kant doesn't use the orange thing. That's W.T. Jones, but uh, that's his picture of what Kant is doing. You look at what your perceptions are, and you know they all occur in time, they all occur in space, they all occur to a certain nexus or a still point that's in the middle of your perceptions. That's the transcendental unity of apperception. And they all appear to be related causally. One thing follows another. Those are the structures through which you see the universe. They aren't structures that you perceive. That's according to Kant. And mathematics is part of that structure. Uh, the Newtonian universe is one that we experience as a result of this. We don't experience the quantum mechanical universe. That's not part of our experience. We've discovered it, and this discovery part of it is part of our experience. And the experience we use to uh, the experiments we use to demonstrate the truth of quantum mechanics is something that we experience in the phenomenal world. But the laws of the quantum mechanics world are not things that are part of our experience. And this is a big puzzle to all physicists. Where's Gerald today? Um, Maybe he could explain some of this to us. But uh, this is a big nightmare in physics that we can't uh, that quantum mechanics does not answer to our the structure that of the mind that Kant describes. And it also is an insult to the idea that's a moral idea, as it were, that Plato had, that the universe is something that makes logical sense. um, so this is really as much, I think, as we need to know for the time being about what Kant's metaphysics are. But it was a big watershed when Kant realized that Hume had kind of destroyed the metaphysical validity of the world we perceive by calling into question causality. He he doubts, let's see, one cannot perceive the quantum world directly. Right. Well, we what we perceive is uh, we perceive the experiments that demonstrate the quantum world, but we don't experience the quantum world ourselves. Because our world is bound by causality, and Kant pointed out that causality is something that is a structure through which we interpret the universe, but we can't say it's part of the noumenal world, nor can we say, and this is oddly enough kind of borne out by modern science, that we know that space and time are in fact not absolute things, but that's the only way we can experience them. We don't uh, travel at the speed of light. We don't have a mass that's the size of the sun. So we experience the world according to Newtonian physics, not according to relativity or quantum mechanics. And that's the big bugaboo in modern physics, is trying to find a way to unify all those things and then make sense of them, is what Plato wanted us to do. Ooh. Um, let's see. I don't know if I'm going to get um, any further on that than we can continue to discuss this, but I don't know if we're going to get any further. I think Kant is not thought of as a lightweight or a weird conspiracy theorist or anything like that. The issues that Kant addresses are still with us, as are the issues that Plato addresses. For people who are really trying to, not like my Lawrence Livermore scientist, who says, look, these things work. Please get out of my presence with the things about why they work. Let's just ignore that if we can for the time being, because I have work to do, and we know that these things work, and so leave me alone. Uh, I don't want to suggest he was rude. He wasn't rude at all, but that was that was definitely his attitude. I don't have time for these kind of silly questions. Um, I guess I was kind of hoping to get through all this in about 10 minutes, but that didn't happen. Anyway, there's a couple more things I wanted to raise that I've thought about because I've gone back and reviewed some of the sessions, and I just thought I would raise them today again. One thing is, why do we study people that we know or that we have arguments against? And I think Aquinas and Hobbes are pretty good examples of guys that I think their arguments don't hold water. I could name some others. Why even paying attention to them? And the reason goes back to that. Well, it's why does Plato not give us the answers? Why does he show us the arguments? Plato taught us from the beginning that you have to consider the arguments. You can't just express an opinion. I don't agree with that. Well, you can. I mean, you're free to do whatever you want. But if you've done that, then you don't own the refutation of it. You don't own the understanding of why it doesn't hold water. And I would argue that's a good thing to do, to know why you think the things you do are correct. The other thing I wanted to bring up today was just in under the heading of reviewing. Uh, we didn't get stuck on this, but I just want to bring it up again. You know, in the Republic, Plato outlaws poetry, and I don't think, surprisingly enough, I don't remember Anne objecting to this strenuously, but she could have. And I just wanted to bring it up again because I think it was raised and then I didn't delve into it. And let me just explain what I think he's people. This is, by the way, a classic criticism of Plato. You know, what an idiot. He outlawed poetry. Doesn't he know anything? I mean, it's a kind of very common, not very deep criticism of Plato, but it's a really common one. So I thought I'd address it today. Remember, two things will help us. One is that Plato thought of the entire republic. This happens in the Republic. He outlaws poetry. Remember that this is a thought experiment, and the thought experiment is supposed to be a magnification of what your soul is. So he's imagining the society, the republic, as a city. But really, Socrates says in the beginning of this, he says, let's just magnify the problems we have in our soul and pretend they're a whole city. Because I think if we magnify it like that and consider the macro, we can get into further details. So one of the things in the Republic is that he wants to outlaw the poets. Why does he want to outlaw the poets? Well, the poets appeal to emotions rather than rationality, or I'm not sure rather than rationality is the right thing to say, but primarily poetry strikes you in the gut rather than it's not like mathematics. Poetry is not like mathematics. And sometimes it's almost incoherent except in its emotional impact. Like you probably couldn't very well sort of, who was it, Susan Sontag, that said interpretation is logic's revenge against poetry. That's not the exact quote, but that's what she said. It's like logic striking back at poetry and interpreting it and making it logical. So anyway, poetry is, like I say, sometimes not very amenable to being rationally understood. That's why it's art and not rationality. Okay, well, why is that a bad thing? Now remember, we're talking about the soul. And remember, there are three parts. This is Plato. There are three parts of the soul. And he doesn't deny that the appetites, the passions, and the rational part of the soul. He doesn't deny that the rational part um, he doesn't say the rational part's the only part of the soul you should pay attention to. He says that all of three parts of the soul have their jobs. The appetitive part of the soul has a job. Otherwise, you wouldn't be hungry and you wouldn't eat and you'd die. So the appetites have a job to do, and so do the people in society that uh, conduct themselves just according to their appetites, because what they're doing is providing all the basic fundamental uh, survival uh, mechanisms and products that will sustain the society. The passionate part of the soul uh, is often also addressed by poetry. The problem for Plato is he doesn't want the poets to become overly powerful. He doesn't want you to pay attention just to the poets, because if you do, you may be led in the direction of your passions and appetites without having them balanced by the rational part of the soul. And for this reason, Plato didn't believe in democracy, because most people are in the appetitive class. They're the journeymen and the waitresses and the dancers and all the people providing the products that sustains society. That's what they're doing. But in order to do what they do, they're stimulated by their appetites. They make money. They produce goods that other people need. And they are essential for the society, just the way your appetite is essential for your soul. You wouldn't ignore that. And also your senses of decency, which is part of the passion part of the soul, your sense of decency and loyalty and those things, they are also really good. However, if they ruled you, you might have loyalty to Hitler. You might have loyalty, as some people do now, to Trump. You might have a passion that says you hate Mexicans because um, this is what you've been stimulated by your appetites to think, is we hate these guys. And so what Plato, I believe, my interpretation, I don't think this is out of left field though. My interpretation is Plato wants to not allow these people to have too much influence, the passionate people and the competitive people. It's not like they can never be heard. They can do their job, but we should rule by our rationality and our good sense. I'm
Uh,
not trying to defend that. I'm just trying to clarify what I think Plato was up to. Yeah, Peter.
I think it's been a long time since I read the Republic. I think at some point Socrates says we don't want poets in our Republic, but doesn't he also more or less advocate censoring poetry rather than driving it out, so that patriotic poems, hymns to the gods, praises of good men are fine, but the freedom of the poet is not fine because he might make us in love with bad men or women, or he might, disseminate unpatriotic or impious sentiments, or, something of that kind. So, I mean, I don't agree with Plato about the poets, but I think there's an argument there that's being made, and it's more or less that it fits with what you've just been saying. The passionate part of the soul is important, but it has to be subordinated all the time rigorously to the rational part. And I think many poets would say, well, it's not worth it to me to write poetry if I'm under that kind of constraint.
Well, but still, in their capacity as a poet, expressing the appetitive or passionate side of the soul, they're doing their job. They can do that. I'd like to. I think you're right about that passage, and I could dig it up out of the Republic, but I think that's correct. But remember, he's directing. This is how we should govern our souls. We ourselves should not be guided by our passions and our appetites. In the end, they are essential for our survival. But if they rule us, we'll be led down a bad path. Yeah, Barry.
I'm just wondering if this isn't connected to the way Aquinas and those guys, treated music and the arts in general, that they were okay if they were supporting the teachings of the church, church, but that they were not okay in and of themselves because they were, basically something of pleasure, and that was suspect because it led us down a sinful path.
I'm not actually, I don't remember what Aquinas says about music, but certainly Augustine says that. And uh, I had Plato has he actually specifies certain scales which are okay and certain scales which aren't. I mean, he actually does that. He mentions them, and I had this student. I don't know if I told you this, but I had this student one time that asked me if for her term paper she could compose songs with all the different scales. It was so good. I said, "Of course you can." So what she did was she composed songs using the different modes that are approved and ones that aren't approved in Plato in the dialogue and recorded a CD for me, which I still have. I thought, what a wonderful project that was. But the idea was Plato thought that and this is still with us today, that music is powerful, and people, as you remember, as we will all remember, there were people who thought that rock and roll was immoral. In fact, Philby just sent me a video of a guy claiming that any music that emphasizes the backbeat, the two and the four, is immoral. This is some kind of Christian guy saying this is no, you can't do that. I don't know. And then I sent Philby back Beer Barrel Polka, which so I guess that's leading us down a horrible, sinful path. But anyway, uh, so she did this, but the idea with Plato is that some of these scales are noble and some of them are weak and cowardly. That was his idea. And to this day, we still think, all of us, that, oh, that music is destroying the youth, or that music is, that's what I like to hear. We still think this. Every generation with with the music that comes up is still critical of the fact that the youth are going to be destroyed by this new music. They said it about jazz, they said it about rock and roll. The country people said it about electrified country music with drums. People said it about punk. They said it about rap. They said it about heavy metal. It goes on. So Plato was just expressing his view in his day of the same kind of sentiment. Anyway,
The mode is good.
I'm sorry.
The Dorian mode is good because it makes you courageous, more like the Spartans, and the Lydian mode is bad because it's sensual and relaxing. I remember that specific, thing in the Republic. I think it's in the Republic.
Yeah, that's where it is. Um, anyway, so those three things I wanted to bring up for for the review. I think we got pretty much what I want to say about Kant's metaphysics. And we still didn't get to his ethics, which are just equally as important. And I do want to do that. And when we get to the ethics, what we had a discussion on, let me see, when did this arise? I think it was in the Euthyphro. And the Euthyphro, there was some of us thought that the Euthyphro was, Socrates was asking for a black and white rule, and that two or three people said there aren't any such things. Everything, people feel this way or that way about something. But there has been a quest since the time of Plato, since Socrates, to find out what are the rules to uh, proper behavior. What are they? And so the next two guys we're going to study on this, Kant and Mill, are the two poster boys for the two types of philosophy. And I think I mentioned this early in the term, uh, deontological and teleological ethics. And so Kant is going to be the poster boy for deontological ethics. And that means rule based, where you have a rule that, like, don't tell a lie or thou shalt not kill. Those are rules. And the that's called deontological. So you base it on rules and not on outcomes. And the other type is called teleological, from Aristotle's telos, purpose. And so that is, what are you trying to achieve? Is this method of governing, or is this kind of behavior that you're uh, doing right now, is it going to achieve a good result? So those are two different kinds of ethics we make a distinction between. And so the poster boy for the first is Kant, and the poster boy for the second is Mill. And I say poster boy, these are the main guys that we consider when we consider non-Christian ethics. I shouldn't say non-Christian as if they're opposed to Christianity, but Christianity itself, of course, has its list of rules and ethics, but these are secular. In other words, Kant and Mill are not going to rely on some kind of scriptural reference for what is good and what is evil. They're trying to make it up without reference to anything that is religious in nature, both of them. And so these are the two secular sources of our ethics to this day. And that's what we'll be talking about. So next time we'll discuss Kant and his categorical imperative, and then time after that, if we get through that, which we probably will, we'll be talking about John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism. So those are the two, and still with us today, those kinds of ways of thinking about ethical problems. So there you have it for today, unless there's more yelling to be about mathematics to be done. No, nothing.
Just glad nobody here said, I hate math.
Boy, I don't hate math. I love math, but I loved it. If I don't know if I told you this, my brother and I were both very good in math in high school, and he went on to be summa cum laude at Pomona in mathematics. And the reason he did it is because math is clear. It isn't all that weird fuzzy stuff like the humanities. He liked things that are clear. And and I didn't like things that were clear. I was the poet in the family. I wanted things that were dreamy and that kind of thing. And so I didn't. I majored in philosophy. Well, it turned out we were both wrong. If you study math long enough, it becomes very fuzzy, and if you study philosophy very much, people try to get really clear on things. And so we both screwed up our entire lives making those immature decisions.
Tony, one thing I'm curious about is whether Kant ever mentions God at all.
Yes.
And that might, if the answer is yes, it might be a topic to for next week.
God for Kant is in the noumena. In other words, he's doesn't exist in a realm that we can have any access to. All we can know about is the physical world. And so this is in answer to Aquinas trying to make a jump from what he can observe in the physical world to making conclusions about the existence of God. Kant would agree with, well, does agree with Hume that those are not possible logical steps to make. And so God is inevitably going to be in a realm that we cannot understand. He doesn't, I am not aware of Kant ever referring to scripture specifically. I don't remember that. I could look that up. But no, basically the answer is no.
Mhm.
He was supposedly a very pious person, though. Peter?
The only Kant book I've read is Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. And I mentioned to a friend of mine who was a philosopher that it was a very hard book. He said, "Oh, that's elementary. If you're reading Kant, it's not a hard book. It's an easy book." But the argument roughly is we must believe in God, immortality, and something like the categorical imperative, because otherwise our moral lives would make no sense. So we don't know, but we have to believe. And I think there's an argument as to whether Kant was trying to sort of tailor his remarks to the climate of the Prussia of his time. But he seems to have been pretty fearless in saying what he actually believed. So the argument seems to be God is in the noumenal world and we can never know him, but we have to believe in him because otherwise our moral lives in the simplest sense, the way we relate to each other, our purposes and so on, wouldn't make sense. I'm not saying I accept that argument, but I think that's roughly his argument.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. The phrase is we must act as if God
Right.
exists, and we must act morally as if there are moral uh, laws. We must act as if there are moral laws, but we can't prove they exist. Morality, along with God, exists in the noumena, and both Mill and Kant are going to admit that they can't demonstrate that there is something called morality. What Kant says is if you're going to uh, be a moral person, if that's what you want to do, then this is what you have to do. But he doesn't prove that you have to be. And Mill basically makes the same statement that I'd have to get the exact quote, but he says you in order to consider the things that we're going to consider, you have to actually have a desire to live a moral life. And this is if you do, then this is these are how I can help you. These rules are how I can help you. Kant and Mill, I think, are similar with that. Doug, gotta go. Okay, bye bye, Doug. And so we'll continue with that. But another quote from Kant, Alan, is I've limited knowledge to make room for faith. And so he wants to put a wall around what we can know. He wants to be clear about what we can know. That's why I said that the phenomenal world should be that term should be considered a limit to what we can know. And beyond that, we have to either have faith or just trust that things make sense. I don't think that's really that inconsistent with traditional Christian theology. It's not inconsistent with Tertullian, for example, or Kierkegaard, really. Anything else? Well, it's been wonderful to meet with you guys as always, and I will see you on Thursday and we'll start talking about ethics with Kant.
See you Thursday.
All
Thank
right,
you.
see you guys.